USAA knows dynamic duos can save the day, like superheroes and sidekicks or auto and home insurance. With USAA, you can bundle your auto and home and save up to 10%. Learn more and get a quote at usaa.com/bundle. Restrictions apply.
In the last few months, a group of Dutch investigative reporters have been doing a great job publishing various stories on what Shell knew and when. They have a project called the Shell Papers. It is on the Platform for Authentic Journalism in the Netherlands, which is a collaborative formed by 4 investigative journalists for the purposes of digging into things exactly like this. I'm joined today by 2 of those journalists. I'm going to let them introduce themselves.
So my name is Alexander Böttcher. I'm an investigative journalist for Platform Authentieke Journalistiek from the Netherlands.
My name is Yillis Mast. I'm also an investigative reporter at the Platform for Authentic Journalism.
And what is the Platform for Authentic Journalism?
The platform, we are a collective of 4 investigative reporters. We started out about 5 years ago because we wanted to contribute to certain undervalued topics within the Dutch media world. So most of all, we focused in the beginning on complex issues like trade agreements and their impacts on the environment and society in general. And then we moved on bit by bit towards lobbying, because lobbying was also like a big part of the whole TTIP and free trade negotiations.
Right.
And from lobbying, we sort of moved on naturally almost to climate change, seeing that this is the most lobbied topic probably at this moment.
We're going to talk about some of their latest findings, including in particular Shell's direct funding of one well-known climate denier in the Netherlands. Sounds to me like this guy was sort of the Fred Singer of Holland. That story and more after a message from this episode's sponsor. I'm Amy Westervelt, and this is Drilled. Hey, Drilled listeners, Amy here to recommend another climate podcast. If you have ever wondered exactly where your water comes from, what it means to actually break up with fossil fuels, or what the year 2100 could even look like, check out the Climate Dispatch from the folks at the Sierra Club Angeles chapter in collaboration with Stranded Astronaut Productions. The show is brand new. It launched in April, just in time for Earth Day, and it answers all those questions and more. The Climate Dispatch explores both global and local stories of the climate crisis through the lens of Southern California. On the show, host Taya Jeanette brings together a variety of guests and experts in conversation to share their climate wins and break down their fears and collective hopes for the future. Some featured guests include Time 100 Next recipient and climate activist Naleli Kobo, Troy Stevens, creative manager of Grist Magazine's Imagine 2200 Climate Fiction Contest, Aru Shaini Ajay, executive director of the Sunrise Movement, and Allison Chin, president of the Sierra Club Board of Directors. Each episode will also feature a local LA-based band or musician to play out the show. Check out the Climate Dispatch at sc.org/climate dispatch or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Hey, it's Paris. You know I love sparkly things, right? Like stars. Duh. And thanks to Hilton and AutoCamp, I just slept under them. Picture me, serving looks by the fire outside my luxurious Airstream, making s'mores with the kids, while a national park is our backdrop. The great outdoors meets Hilton hospitality. That's hot. Explore all the new ways to stay at Hilton.com. Hilton for the stay.
A year ago, we started the Shell Papers. where we wanted to do a FOIA request regarding about 15 years of documents regarding communication between the Dutch government and Royal Dutch Shell, in order to see, like, structurally what kind of cooperation exists between Shell and the Dutch state. So we wanted to see, like, in what ways does Shell influence Dutch policy.
Mm-hmm. How did you kind of come upon the person who's at the center of your latest investigation?
Yeah, we investigated Fritz Böttcher, a man who we didn't know actually before our investigation. But Fritz Böttcher is generally known, or was known in the 90s, as one of the founders of the climate skeptic movement in the Netherlands.
Mm.
And before that, he was known as one of the founders of the Club of Rome, which was founded in 1968 and warned against the excessive economic growth with its famous report, Limits to Growth.
Mm-hmm.
So he was in general a well-known scientist, professor in chemistry, and he actually got involved in the climate debate in the 90s. Through his own articles and lectures. He appeared on television and in newspapers and radio interviews. And yeah, he was one of the first known climate skeptics, which in the first decade when the topic became a hot issue in global politics. So
that's an interesting trajectory, though, from the Club of Rome to climate skeptic.
Yeah, it is. Always fascinated us, because it seemed a bit contradictory to be first part of a group which warned against too much excessive economic growth, and then to seem to be on the other side of the debate.
Right.
But yeah, this is an interesting history as well. It seemed like what we know from people who actually know him from the Club of Rome, who have also written about his role in this club, is that he, within this club or this informal network, he was also part of the more conservative wing, let's say, of within this network. So it was not necessarily contradictory that within this club he already also took a position where he actually kind of downplayed the panic that followed the publication of the first report. So. Especially within the Netherlands, this Club of Rome had a huge impact. It became like a media hype, in the words of Fritz Böttcher. Mm-hmm. And he was actually a bit annoyed by this. We see this also in his personal archive, that he didn't like this panic. And this was like the first time that he became an outspoken, actually a critic of the environmental movement, which, although he was part of the group, he also took a stance against the environmental movement, which used this report to call for government interference in business. He was pro-market.
Right. So he wanted businesses to choose to limit growth themselves.
Yeah, some self-restraint was his idea.
Right. Okay.
He mostly focused also in his Club of Rome activities. His whole point was that there's no such thing as, well, there is such a thing as depletion of resources, but the problem is that we cannot access a lot of those. So we need to develop more technology in order to reach oil and gas or coal in places that are thus far unreachable.
Interesting. That's really interesting. Okay, so did you get a sense of how he sort of got into the climate skeptic movement in the 90s?
Yeah, well, he was involved or interested in the topic already since the end of the 70s. 1979, as I understand it, there was already an international conference about it and some attention to it. So he was interested in this debate from the beginning. And this was still at a time when he combined his work as an academic with advisory work for Royal Dutch Shell. So he has always combined this during his career. He was at the same time a professor and also part-time advisor of board of Royal Dutch Shell regarding research, their research policy. So he worked for Shell from 1953 to 1983, so for 3 decades. more or less. And he was familiar with the heads, the main CEOs. He considered them to be his personal friends. At the end of the 70s, there was a discussion about the greenhouse effect beginning. So he got involved in immediately, and also supported by Shell already in 1979. The first sign of support from Royal Dutch Shell to him regarding the greenhouse effect is actually from 1979, when Shell financed a small research of Frits Böttcher into the greenhouse effect to see what was right and what was wrong about this theory, as he would call it. And this was actually already the first time when he started to develop his skeptic arguments and vision. And we see from personal notes in his personal archive that he had this skeptic theory based on the Gaia theory of James Lovelock, believing in the self-regulating powers of planet Earth, and believing in the positive feedback effects. But he was never a climate scientist. He was a professor in chemistry. But he started to read in the 80s as well the literature from American climate skeptics, Richard Lindzen, and he already knew people like Fred Singer and other American skeptics, which you have talked about in your podcast as well. He knew them from international policy circles like the OECD, for which he was also a delegate. So he was familiar with the American skeptics, and he followed them, but he didn't really become a vocal critic of the climate scientists until 1989, more or less. What we found to be his CO2 project, as he called it, like a big skeptic project, which he ran for almost a decade. That started in 1989.
Interesting. And did the funding for that come from Shell as well?
Yes, yeah, that's our main discovery. So, and the biggest surprise to us, because we started this research just to investigate, to write kind of like a background article about what is already known about Shell's role in the climate debate, and we didn't expect to find this kind of direct support to climate skeptics, because in general, Shell is like known as more like unlike Exxon, like a company which has a bit of attention for the environment and which isn't that aggressive in funding, climate denialism. That's why we didn't expect to find this kind of direct support. But his personal archive, Frits Böttcher, he died in 2008, so he left his archive in the city of Haarlem in a small archive, 156 boxes, reports of meetings and letters and personal notes. Fascinating to read. But the story that we discovered in his archive is that he was supported from the very beginning by Shell to start this CO2 project, to get involved publicly in the climate debate, to be critical about climate science and the IPCC. And he received direct financial support for this as well from 1990 to 1998, around 1 million guildens. So that's like 800,000 euros today, more or less.
Wow. And can you talk a little bit more about what this carbon project of his was? I think I read in your story that he was one of these guys who pushed the idea that, more CO2 just means more plants on Earth, and that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Yes. That was his favorite argument, was that CO2 is a blessing because plants use it to grow. He also referred to garden houses and how they add CO2 in order to stimulate the growth of plants and things like that. So that was one of his favorite talking points when it came to sort of the blessings of CO2, because he hated the way that CO2 was portrayed in the media as if it was like toxic or poisonous or something like that, making the claim that it's essential for life on Earth, which is of course true, but not the issue. Right. Yeah, that's interesting. So what kinds of things was he doing through this project? Well, the type of things that he did was mostly, getting himself in the public eye. So he wrote articles, published several books and became like a spokesperson for the climate skeptic movement as it was growing then in the 90s. And in 1996, he in one of his notes, he says that he's become the opposition leader of the climate skeptic movement in the Netherlands. And so he, for example, was invited for a parliamentary commission that was charged in 1995 by the Dutch government in order to sort of see like, climate change, what is it and what are we supposed to do about it? He said things in the same line as CO2 is good for plants. And those were the quotes that also made it to like the Dutch national news. But on the other hand, he was maybe even more influential in his own network, basically. Mm-hmm. So this Böttcher, he had throughout his life, he was on the board of several big Dutch companies. And the way that he works is like he would write an article or publish a book. He would send it to his friends in the boardrooms, and then they would use it again to lobby towards politicians against taking measurements in order to reduce CO2 emissions. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, for example, like there are letters in the archive between Frits Böttcher and Karl-Heinz Büchel, who was then part of the board of directors of Bayer, the big German chemical company. Mm-hmm. And then Büchel writes in response to receiving his book, he's very enthusiastic about the book, that he sent it through to the Dutch Minister of the Environment. I think it's sort of similar towards the way that climate skeptics have worked in general. So you write an article or a book that has some scientific weight to it. You send that to your friends, and they use it then to start lobbying or say that, hey, there's so much doubt about climate change. You shouldn't take any measures to reduce CO2 emissions because we don't even know if those measures are necessary.
Mm-hmm. Right. You know, I have spent a lot of time studying these guys because I find them interesting from like a psychological standpoint too. So I'm curious if you found anything that indicated sort of what the ideological underpinning of his work was, or like what was driving him beyond just getting money from Shell and whoever else.
Well, the interesting thing with Böttcher is that he did not receive the money himself, or he worked for free basically. Yeah. He was already retired. He was 80 years old when this project started. Wow. And the money that he received, he used it to pay his 2 assistants and to cover like travel expenses and things like that. Yeah. So you can consider him as a true believer when it came to his a believer in his own story when it came to climate change.
Yeah.
But also it's a bit strange because he also this whole project, it lasts for 9 years, and it lasts only during the time that these companies are willing to pay for it. So when in 1998 the funding stops, he also stops working on the CO2 project. And starts working on other advisory work. So yes, he was a true believer, but also I think vulnerable for the type of the prestige that came along with it. So the CEOs in these companies, they are worried about climate change. They need somebody to tell another story, basically, or a story that fits them better. Mm-hmm. They saw this guy and saw he was useful. And for Böttcher, it was like, I matter. I still matter. I've been, through my whole life, I've been in these boardrooms and been with all these important people. After I retired, this sort of stopped. And this was a way for him to sort of get back in the spotlight.
Right. That makes sense. That's really interesting. What was the impact of his work in terms of government policy or anything? Did you find any evidence of him having an impact there?
Yeah, it's the opinions are they vary a little bit, but in general, people who knew him personally, they or worked in government at the time, some high policymakers, they say, well, he had a huge influence just because he had such a high standing, a big reputation. He knew everybody knew him. Mm-hmm. People who were all looking for an alternative story, they came to Böttcher, and so he had a huge informal influence. Also because he had this reputation of, being one of the founders of the Club of Rome. So people were like, if he said it, there must be some truth. He isn't.
Right.
He had the image of being an environmentally aware scientist. So this reputation helped him a lot. And this is actually also acknowledged in one fascinating report of a meeting with his main contact within Royal Dutch Shell, Huub van Engelshoven. So van Engelshoven tells Böttcher, according to this report, that he has more influence as a scientist when he talks about climate than when the CEOs of the companies talk about it. So they were well aware that his reputation as a scientist, as an independent scientist, helped to get his message across. And he wasn't on television and radio interviews. Other people say, well, you shouldn't overestimate it. It's really difficult to measure in general. But if we look in general to how the media in the Netherlands writes about this topic, we also see that in general the Dutch media has given ample space to the skeptic point of view. There are several reports about this. One report says that like 18% of the articles in Dutch media are skeptical, which is of course not representative of the opinions within the scientific community.
Right.
If you look in the Netherlands, it's just a handful of people like Böttcher, and the people who are active today, they can all kind of directly or indirectly be linked to him. So, Frits Böttcher, his influence is not only because he was present in the media, but also because he mentored like a new generation. And we see this also in his archive, that he had a lot of contact with another journalist, Simon Roosendaal, who still writes today and is like one of the best known skeptics until recently. Now he starts to acknowledge that the IPCC is actually right, but he followed the mission of Frits Böttcher, and he was for one of the biggest magazines of the Netherlands. He has written like dozens of articles about this, and with an enormous reach. Another, a well-known skeptic, Hans Laboom, still active today, still active, collaborating with the current climate skeptic groups like Clintel, which is a new organization. He was also personally mentored by Frits Böttcher. So this handful of people who has, reached a huge audience, they can all kind of be linked to Böttcher, and they have all, many of them have been mentored by him to spread this message and to continue his fight, as he would call it himself.
Okay, that's it for this time. I hope you enjoyed this episode. We'll drop links to various stories that have come out of the Shell Papers reporting in our show notes. Be sure to check those out. One thing to note, after our interview, Alexander sent me an email clarifying that it wasn't just Shell that was funding this Böttcher guy. There were 24 other firms that were also funding his climate skepticism. So he wanted to be clear that it wasn't solely a Shell campaign. However, they were really surprised to find that Shell had been directly funding this guy in any way at all. You can see all the details behind that reporting and many other stories in the links that we'll drop in the show notes today. And a reminder, if you haven't yet signed up for one of our various membership options, I highly recommend doing that in the next few weeks so that you can be amongst the first to listen to our next investigative series. It is a zinger. Speaking of which, a big shout out to our most recent Patreon sponsors. They are Sarah Hale, Civil Politics Radio, Stefan, Stephanie Black, Melissa Hoffer, David, Ian McCauley, and Patricia Hine. Thank you guys. Your support keeps us going. It is paying for part of the production of that next season I mentioned. So really very much appreciated. We are still keeping the COVID climate policy tracker going on our website as well. And we'll have a lot of new stories and series coming up on the website for you there too. Members get early access to a lot of those stories, plus bonus content, both in print and in audio. You also get ad-free podcast episodes. And some of our membership levels now come with merchandise. You can get a drilled coffee cup. We also have a new store launching soon with that stuff. So if you just want a mug without the membership, you'll be able to do that too. Thanks again for listening, and we will see you next time.